Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's book talk, American Fragments, with Daniel Diez Couch. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, and I'm honored to serve as president of the American Antiquarian Society. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. The American Antiquarian Society is a national research library located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and make accessible materials printed or produced before 1900 in what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, manuscripts, newspapers and magazines, graphic arts materials, and children's literature. We have more than 4.5 million artifacts over about 25 miles of shelves. Today's talk is sponsored by our program in the history of the book in American culture, which promotes the study of print culture, the study of publishing, reading, and writing, and their uses throughout American history. And today's program begins our third year of these book talks. The American Antiquarian Society supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the country and indeed around the world to use our reading room and also to seek out our digitized materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like today's virtual program, and you can go to our website for continual updates. We thank you for joining us, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. For those who are unfamiliar with Zoom, my colleague Amanda Kondek will be sharing a few notes in the chat on how to use the Zoom webinar functions today. She'll also be posting links and relevant information in the chat throughout the program. To open the chat, click the chat box item located on the bottom of your screen. To ask questions of our speaker, please use the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring the Q&A function throughout the program, and after Dr. Couch's presentation, I'll be asking questions that you have submitted through the Q&A function. I'd also like to remind everyone that this program is being recorded and will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel within the next few weeks. Now it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker. Daniel Diez Couch is Associate Professor of English at the United States Air Force Academy, where he has taught since 2017. He earned his PhD at UCLA and spent a postdoctoral year at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His writing has appeared in a variety of venues, including Leviathan, a Journal of Melville Studies, Arizona Quarterly, and the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation, among a number of others. He's held fellowships at numerous scholarly centers and libraries, including the McNeill Center, the American Philosophical Society, the Huntington Library, the William L. Clements Library, and, most important for our purposes, he held the Reese Fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society right here in 2020. Daniel Diez Couch's new book, published earlier this year, is entitled American Fragments, The Political Aesthetic of Unfinished Forms in the Early Republic. Daniel, welcome back virtually to the American Antiquarian Society, and I'll now turn it over to you to share your screen and tell us about your book. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thanks also to Amanda Kondek and also Scott for the kind of organizational work that you guys have put into this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And there we go. That should be, oh, I think there's another box up. There we go. Perfect. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about my work here with everyone today. And of course, to hear any thoughts or questions that you all might have. So I'll start off with a kind of more general discussion of how this project came to be. And then I'll go over a more specific example from the book that will give you a sense of how the chapters are working. And then we'll move forward to some broader concluding thoughts about the stakes of this work. So in the first place, American Fragments examines literary fragments that were published in America roughly between 1770 and 1830. Now, these were texts that were intentionally composed as fragments. So that's different from two other kinds of fragments. A historical fragment recovered from the past, like a scrap of manuscript from a dead author, or an unintentional fragment, such as a work that an author simply left unfinished at their death. So the text I'm primarily interested in were works that authors decided would be fragments, sort of sat down with the intention of composing a fragment. So my thoughts about this topic started up in a twofold way. First, as an archival question, and then as a comparative one. So I'll go through both of those. Fragments initially took root in my mind as I read through the periodical file of the American Museum for the year 1787, a magazine that was edited by the Irish-American printer and publisher Matthew Carey. The January 1787 issue featured essays by Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and other early American luminaries, and included writing on a range of political subjects about the early nation. And here we can see a later portrait of Matthew Carey along with some tidbits from that issue. Alongside the articles that focused on large-scale themes pertinent to a broad readership, Carey also printed 3 curious essays subtitled Fragments: The Prostitute, a Fragment; The Slave, a Fragment; and Negro Trade, a Fragment. Unlike the majority of the compositions published in that opening installment of the magazine, these fictional fragments did not explicitly deal with the current state of crisis in the nation. Instead, they turned away from the center and toward the periphery to look at the lives of those whom the middle and elite classes called the lower sort: the disregarded, the destitute, the ill, the disabled. The brief essays shifted the magazine's focus from the macro scale of contemporary events to the everyday people residing in Philadelphia and places like it all over the young nation. So Carey's writings provided an unexpected glimpse into the lives of individuals that often existed on the margins of the nation. So what I discovered as I continued my research into fragments was that in the years that span the independence and the start of the Jacksonian period, roughly from the 1770s to the 1830s, American readers consumed an enormous number of literary fragments. So as I've already mentioned, these texts were intentionally constructed by their authors to give the impression of being a piece of a larger whole, even if that whole never existed. So that's to say, Carey's fragments are not actually broken off from a longer work, but they do suggestively imply the presence of such a text. Whether they were imported from England and Europe or authored by writers in their hometown, published within a novel, or released in an issue of the Massachusetts magazine, audiences encountered fragments throughout the entire landscape of print media. The ample number of fragments that appeared in the literary archive of the early United States raised a complex question for me about the relationship between aesthetic and national realities. What kind of artistic creation was a fragment, and how did deliberately unfinished writing play into the politics of the early years of the nation? Despite the prominence of literary fragments throughout the nation's printscape, virtually no work existed to answer this question. And that was especially striking to me because quite the opposite has taken place outside of the American context. So here's where I started to see how the archive that I was encountering could fit into other conversations in literary studies. And in some ways, the study became comparative as well. Fragments have, in fact, received extensive attention in studies of British and German Romanticism. Incompleteness, fragmentation, and ruin, Thomas McFarland argued in Romanticism and the Forms of Ruin, not only receive a special emphasis in Romanticism, but also seem actually to define that phenomenon. Writing after McFarland's study, Marjorie Levinson categorized the British Romantic fragment poem, which she recognized as a peculiarly romantic form, and argued that literary criticism assigns fragments an unusually motivated and expressive condition within the early 19th century. Literary historians have presented fragments as an exemplary romantic expression, to borrow Levinson's phrasing, and the form bears repeated study with each successive generation. Why then were fragments so central to British Romanticism and so neglected from the American variety of scholarship, even as the nascent United States experienced a rage for fragments? So with these questions in the back of my mind, I set out to chart a sense of the fragment from the early years of the nation all the way through to the early 19th century, a moment in which the publication of fragments reached its apex on both sides of the Atlantic. As the noted literary critic Francis Jeffrey commented in the Edinburgh Review in 1813, the taste for fragments, we suspect, has become very general, and the greater part of polite readers would now no more think of sitting down to a whole epic than to a whole ox, a very big meal. This is, he admitted, a taste which we, the critics, are rather inclined to patronize. But it wasn't enough for me just to sort of recover this popular form from the archive, but I also wanted to deeply question what were its cultural and political conditions. What precisely was its role in these early years of national development? And what I found was that the fragment was a distinctly political form. And I mean that not just in a historical sense, in that it was used in a particular way, but also that the form as such afforded that political position. So let me repeat that distinction because I think it's an important one. It's not only significant for me that people use the fragment in a politically motivated way, although that's certainly very important, but also that the form of the fragment itself afforded that opportunity and that you couldn't get quite the same results with a different genre like a sketch, an episode, or a novel. What I found was that throughout this period, fragments primarily focused on minoritarian individuals, the lower sort that Matthew Carey's texts examined. I rarely found fragments focusing on people like doctors, lawyers, priests, politicians. Instead, the figures representing these texts consisted of the socially marginalized, people who'd been sort of fragmented from society, the poor, the destitute, the forgotten, the abused. And the writers that I examine in the early chapters use a fragment as a progressive form, wielding it as a tool for thinking through the identities of the lower sort. But to return to the distinction I just made, it was the specific formal elements of the fragment that made this possible. Time and again, both the narrative and temporal elements of the form allowed authors the ability to present that political argument. So I'm going to discuss those two elements in order, first the narrative and then the temporal. In narrative terms, the unfinished quality of fragments enabled audiences to conceive of newly imagined wholes that could complete the broken part. Readers who encountered the form found texts that began in medias res, lacked parts in the middle, and closed without a proper ending. And these attributes were often represented visually on the printed page. So here we can see how in this particular fragment, which is just one example from many that I could have selected, it begins in the middle of things. And the cutoff part there is visually represented by these 5 asterisks at the beginning. And that's a feature that we're going to see later in the talk as well. And this fragment also ends inconclusively. So kind of both ends of it are cut off. But this lack of narrative parts proved to be an advantage. Because of this characteristic, fragments afforded writers, readers, editors, critics, a large degree of imaginative power over that undefined whole, which existed as a portion outside of the printed piece of writing. Fragments invited completion, even as that completion could only be accomplished outside of the text and in the minds of readers. After the abrupt conclusion of each fragment, the prostitute could hypothetically rejoin her family, the enslaved man could live a free life, and the immoral slave trader could be redeemed. In this way, the narrative and visual structure of fragments generated a spectrum of possible completions for the construction of identity. So in addition to this narrative element, the form also has an important temporal element, as it designates a sharp rupture that takes place in the past and also offers the idea of possible reattachment in the future. So I mean, the idea of a fragment is that sometime in an indeterminate past, it was broken off from something. And with that kind of breaking off, there's also the possibility of it being reattached to some bigger whole. So we might here use Gerard Genet's terms for narrative time, using the analeptic, the past breakage, and the proleptic, the future reattachment. The result then is that we have a form that simultaneously invokes the past and the future. But more often than not, writers place an emphasis on the latter, on the future, thinking through how these marginalized individuals could be completed or made whole sometime in an indeterminate future outside of the text. So we can see hopefully how the narrative structure and the temporal elements of the fragment are working hand in hand, the narrative and visual incompletion of the text folding into the way that it's pointing toward the future. So through the investigation of the form of fragments, that which Samuel Otter calls the disposition, contour, structure, and specificity of a work, which opens questions about the relations of parts and wholes, my readings seek to demonstrate the ways in which writers used art to reshape the kinds of statements and ways of being that were possible in the political sphere. For now, though, let's turn away from some of these broader historical and theoretical dimensions, and let's turn to a more specific example that will give you a stronger sense of the ways in which fragments were being leveraged by authors in the period to sort of imaginatively rehabilitate these individuals. I'd like to think through this idea with Samuel Jackson Pratt's popular transatlantic novel about the American Revolution, titled Emma Corbett, or The Miseries of Civil War, which was first published in 1780. So we can see here a later portrait of Pratt alongside the title page from the London edition of the novel. Crucially, even though Emma Corbett was first published in Bath and London, it found a large transatlantic audience with printings in Philadelphia and Boston, the latter of which especially will play into my discussion here. So here we can see the title pages from the editions I just mentioned, the Philadelphia edition on the left, printed and published by Robert Bell in 1782, and the Boston, well, it was printed in Newburyport, Boston edition on the right, printed in 1784 by John Michael. Throughout his novel and across the various editions, Pratt makes use of a fragment to visually depict the effects of traumatic injury resulting from warfare. And I should mention that he's not the only figure in American Fragments that uses fragments as a means of representing violence. So Susanna Rosen and Hannah Webster Foster also think through violence using the form of the fragment. In Emma Corbett, though, Pratt doesn't really describe the injuries with language as those other authors do, so much as he uses the typography associated with fragments to demonstrate his point, employing asterisks, ellipses, and other punctuation marks. Again, just to reemphasize, Pratt, of course, uses language, it's a novel, to describe what's happening, but he's using punctuation to represent the violence on the bodies of a group of veterans. Punctuation marks were, in fact, used by 18th century writers going back at least to Jonathan Swift to mark their texts as fragments. So here we can see an example from Swift's 1704 publication, Battle of the Books, in which he uses rows of asterisks to show a fragmented text, indicating the kind of different missing parts of it, sort of imagining here like a torn manuscript and a piece of a manuscript missing. So Pratt is building on this tradition from Swift and others, but also altering it, not just using punctuation to show a partial text, but using it to represent a partial body too, homing in on the way that survivors of war often exist in a literally fragmented state with their bodies missing limbs. Pratt is thus bringing his readers to the edge of narrative to recuperate the bodies of disabled veterans. So I'm just going to give a brief framing of the novel while we have the American title pages back on the screen, and then we're going to move into discussion of the fragment itself, which is presented as a kind of inset story within the novel. It's provided in a letter from one character to another. At the start of the novel, the main character, Emma Corbett, feels caught between her father, Charles, and her suitor, Henry Hammond. The former, her father, supports the American side of the revolution, and the latter wants to go to the colonies to fight for England. Emma's caught between the two, and there's a lot of back and forth drama that occurs with her father telling Emma that she's no longer allowed to marry Henry, and at the same time, she's worried about his physical safety while he's crossing the Atlantic. In the midst of these events, a friend of Emma's named Caroline Arnold writes her a letter and encloses a transcription of a story in the envelope. The account is titled A Military Fragment, The Carbines. Caroline believes, mistakenly, that the tale told in the fragment will comfort Emma and assuage the pain she feels after being separated from Henry. Caroline introduces the fragment by noting that for her, It demonstrates how humanity and bravery are nearly allied, and the tender husband and good soldier often form the same character, though they cannot always exert themselves in the same moment. But this somewhat naive interpretation of war does very little to mitigate the anxiety that Emma feels on Henry's behalf. After reading a military fragment, Emma reacts by exclaiming, "Oh, what does your Caroline's fragment prove? But that war at best is terrible as glorious." Through her emphasis on the terrible nature of war, Emma is clearly expressing the fact that the text she receives from Caroline contradicts the reassurance that her friend seeks to provide. And I contend Pratt would push us toward Emma's reading, one that highlights the violent nature of conflict. Indeed, the inset story of a military fragment begins in medias res, when an unnamed narrator, taking a tour of a military hospital, sees a wound on the cheek of a veteran. The narrator states that he observes a tear upon the cheek of the person appointed to show me the hospital, a description that initiates an ambiguous relationship among the bodily tear on the wounded person, the sentimental eyes tear that provides sympathy for the veteran, and the textual tears that make the tale of fragments. So Pratt's getting a lot of mileage out of that term. And we'll see also the word is sort of anticipating in subsequent pages Pratt's experimentation with extended dashes that tear across the white space of the page. After the narrator of the fragment asks about the man's cheek, the hospital guide introduces himself to the narrator as Julius Carbine and takes him to another hospital room where he presents his nieces, nephews, and elder brother, Nestor Carbine, calling him a remnant of a noble figure. Both Carbine brothers proceed to discuss the injuries and stumps on various parts of their bodies, describing the lost limbs in connection to the British Empire. Crucially, Pratt relies on typography to represent the partial presence created by the former existence and current absence of their arms and legs. When Julius explains his relationship with his brother, he comments on the history of their upbringing. And this image here is taken from the London edition, but we're going to look at the American editions in just a second. We slept in the same cradle and were nursed up for the service. Our little arms. He flourished a stump which projected about 4 inches from the right shoulder. Our little arms. But I had begun the matter wrong and prematurely. For before I relate the account which Carbine gave of himself, I should offer some description of his person, as well as that of his brother Nestor. It is the stump of Julius which reminds me of this. So Pratt's typography here extends beyond the spoken to the physical. In the Bath edition, the London edition, and the Dublin edition, all of which use almost identical impressions, the printers use extended dashes after arms, shoulder, and the repetition of arms, as we can see here on the slide. Importantly, though, these extended dashes change when the book is reprinted in America. Michael's 1784 Boston edition, which we can see here displayed for us in detail and with proper attribution to the Antiquarian Society, I might add, where this copy is held. Michael's edition takes the suggestion provided by the versions published across the Atlantic and extends the dashes even further, interrupting the space of the page and presenting the reader with a graphic representation that hangs off the end of arms. The typographical gestures begin in London, but the novel travels to revolutionary Boston, where a consciousness of war reinscribes the physical and emotional pain of the injured soldiers, creating what I call in my analysis a typographical prosthesis on the page. Emma Corbett's republication in Michael's print shop embellishes the typography of the original edition and turns an already anti-war novel into an even more dramatic representation of political protest. So in this moment, Pratt's text is sort of explicitly and discernibly signaling a physical epistemology of the body. The specificity of the comment that the stump projected about 4 inches from the right shoulder provides a discrete sense of how the soldier's body occupies the space of the hospital room and the narrator's visual field. But Pratt isn't just relying on a quantitative measure of the body here. Instead, he's also opting for a representational approximation. The mention of the little arms, for instance, refers to multiple elements that span the Carbine brothers' lives. The arms that the veterans had when they were children, the weapons that they used to fight in the wars of the British Empire, the limbs that they lost in service of that empire, and the little arms of their stumps. And most significantly, I think, the little arms also signify the dashes that extend outward from the lines of the text and reach into the white space of the page. So using this punctuation, Pratt and the printers of Emma Corbett work out a typographical prosthesis for the disabled veterans, with the dashes roughly imagining the way human arms project into space and take up room, or the way that the veterans might remember the space of their arms as they slept in the same cradle before they lost them in combat. Taking the veterans out of the sick room, Pratt moves them onto the reading page instead, creating a new architecture of physicality for these wounded individuals. I want to stay with this passage just a moment longer, though, because the fact that Julius flourished his stump also endows the passage with a sense of physical movement. So I want to just pay attention to the word flourish here just for a moment, and how it was used in the period and how we might interpret it. So a printer's ornament, a design, border, or special illustration that could designate a section break, was also called a mark, a fleuron, or a flourish, giving the usage of the word in Pratt's novel a specific definition in relation to the printing trade. And here on the screen, we can see just one example from the early 19th century, from one of my favorite oddities from the period, Timothy Dexter's The Pickle for the Knowing Ones. And this kind of ornament would be very, very typical, as I'm sure many of you know, and is found in countless printings. While printers' flourishes are typically more elaborate than an elongated dash and usually refer to elements of design, as we can see in the example here, the representation of the bodily flourish through the typography of dashes reveals Pratt's reliance on the imaginative and aesthetic potentials of ink. Instead of presenting Julius and his brother in a static, corporeal state that fixes the connotations of their wounds, Pratt opts for a kinetic, visual depiction that moves them just outside of language and provides their figures with a gestural component, a flourish. So by way of closing my discussion of Emma Corbett here, I'll bring in one final point that speaks to the fragmentary nature of this inset chunk of text that's contained within the novel. The wounds on the bodies of the Carbine brothers extend to the structure of their story as well, because the tale that they tell does not survive in a complete form. We can think of it then as the missing body parts of the soldiers aligning with the missing textual parts of a military fragment. So he's bringing the body and text into a kind of correspondence. In the middle of Julius's narration, an unnamed editor writes the following: "Here the fragment is torn." And on the left side here, we have the Philadelphia edition, which is using dashes to represent that tearing. And on the right side, we have the Boston edition, which is using asterisks. I'm going to throw up a detail of them right now. After that initial tear, the story continues, but only a few lines after the first interruption, the editor again mentions a gap, a second rent in the fragment. And you can see that at the bottom of the Philadelphia edition, which is the top image there. Thus, the title of the story, A Military Fragment, not only refers to the broken, missing body parts of the Carbine brothers, but also to the shape of the text itself, which visually breaks off from the narrative, begins in medias res, and contains typographical gaps that prevent the transmission of a full history. Like the bodies of the soldiers, the body of the text needs its own prosthetic that memorializes lost passages. And all of the printers of Emma Corbett strive to visually emphasize the gaps in the story. The fragment as a form, then, serves an important purpose for Pratt and his fellow printers. It offers a mode which provides for the representation of absence, for the depiction of missing parts, whether those be bodily or textual. In his hands, the fragment affords a means of visualizing through typography a way of conveying absent body parts, opting to think through the effects of violence in a figurative vein rather than a descriptive one. So Pratt was not, of course, the only writer interested in using fragments to represent marginalized figures. Other authors, including Matthew Carey, as we saw, Hannah Webster Foster, Susanna Rosen, Lydia Sigourney, and a host of anonymous newspaper and periodical writers make appearances throughout my study. But as American Fragments moves forward in chronological time, we see how the fragment also shifts in its function. So by way of starting to think about a conclusion, I'll talk you through a little bit more of the arc of this project. We're going to make a slight shift here in order to show the breadth of where my research has taken me. The example from Emma Corbett comes earlier in my chronological progression, so we're moving forward. As American Fragments moves toward its conclusion, I eventually show how the political interests of the fragment ultimately shed those origins and become significantly less interested in representing the marginalized. The final pages of the study examine how the fragment diminished as a political tool and instead became instrumental for market considerations in terms of authorship. More and more, as the 19th century progressed, the form was used to signal the position of author. To attain the status of professional author in a moment when that was only just becoming a viable career path, writers needed to demonstrate their artistic ability to their audiences. The fragment, with its kind of unhewn aesthetic and expanding popularity, especially after the publication of lyrical ballads by Coleridge and Wordsworth, it was ready at hand, and it was valued precisely because it revealed writing not as a completed product, but as something in process. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the idea is that by showing their writing as in process, authors could show readers the architecture of their writing, sort of putting readers in the moment of their composition and convincing them of their authorial position that way, sort of how you would show someone a draft to show that you're working on something. Instead of exclusively using the fragment as a political tool, as the earlier stages of my study show, writers began in the early 19th century to use fragments as a means of indicating a phase in the composition of a text. As Marjorie Levinson describes it, the poet's publication of his own fragment implied a compositional history, which the reader, if he were to appreciate the text as a poem, had both to believe and to acknowledge as a legitimate mode of literary production. Even just titling a text, a fragment, invoked what Levinson calls a compositional history that pushed readers to imagine how it began, why it was interrupted, and how it could be completed by the writer in the future. Placing the reader in the midst of the literary production that shaped the work meant acknowledging the text as a text and the author as an author. So this meant that writers like Charles Brockton Brown, Washington Irving, Sarah Wentworth Morton, and others were able to use the fragment less as a means of altering their social political surroundings and more as a means of leveraging their own position as professional authors. So we can see this too in Andrew Piper's explanation of a romanticism that foregrounded the relational structure of the book. The idea that there was a bibliographic elsewhere, before and after, with which books and their texts were increasingly engaged. Fragments, with their invocation of a prior rupture, were particularly successful at foregrounding that relational structure, getting readers to imagine the before and after of a text, and sort of in that way showing readers the composition process with its haltings, beginnings, endings, interruptions. So what I want to emphasize here in closing is that in whatever manifestation the fragment had, it played a crucial role in this period of American literary history. But even moving forward into the century, into the middle of the 19th century, we can still see the persisting significance of this form. Early in their careers, for example, writers like William Cullen Bryant, Herman Melville, and Nathaniel Hawthorne published fragments. One of Bryant's first poems was simply titled A Fragment. Hawthorne published an early text, an early story titled Fragments from the Journal of a Solitary Man. And Melville's first published story was titled Fragments from a Writing Desk. At the same time, I think that this period also constituted the waning years of the fragment in the 19th century, when authors started to shift away from what I call the explicitly stated fragment and toward an implicit fragmentation. So essentially they ceased to, or much less, titled their text fragments and began more and more to move towards the style of fragmentation as embedded in their writing without sort of explicitly calling it out in the title. Some of the most famous authors of the era, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Emily Dickinson, may not have written fragments per se, but their compositions have been decidedly described as fragmentary. Digressions, interruptions, and incompletions constitute some of the primary traits of their writing, even though their works might not overtly state that. Such writers are, as I hope my book shows, indebted to an energetic and popular literary tradition that spanned both sides of the Atlantic. We can see each of these thinkers working through these ideas. In Emily Dickinson's poem, To Fill a Gap, she considers fragments as enlisting an irresolvable suspension. To fill a gap, insert the thing that caused it. Block it up with other, and 'twill yawn the more. You cannot solder an abyss with air. The transformation of the fragment throughout the Romantic period, its migration from a form used to represent the lower sort in a politically progressive way, to one that writers used to convey a sense of authorship, and finally to its subtle integration within the style of a text, recommends an avenue for rethinking the writers and literature of this period. Through the lens of the literary history of the fragment, the texts of our most famous names become less grounded in coherent, stable, and unified narrative structures, and more distinctly engaged with the partial, the incomplete, and the fragmentary. This viewpoint, I think, should encourage critics to study the ways in which writers intentionally opt for the aesthetics of unfinished forms over and above completeness. The way transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson found truth in gleams and fragments. The marked obsession poets like Walt Whitman had with the creation of beautiful, dripping fragments, or how the literature of surrounding the Civil War was suffused with the remains of violence and moldering battlefields left behind. In our search to create logical narratives that provide a satisfying historical wholeness, I think we've often missed how these fragmentary elements offer an equally important framework of understanding. American Fragments strives to attune ourselves to the process by which 18th and 19th century American writers drew on and transformed the formal and political complexity of the fragment. Such an analysis hopefully allows us to fill more clearly the gaps in our own accounts of the making of American literature. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This is a fascinating project, and I really very much enjoyed reading the book. The floor is open for questions from members of our audience. We've got about 45 to 50 people here in the audience today, so please feel free to jump in with questions on the Q&A. I will start with one. Actually, I have several. One goes back to the origins of the project for you. How did you find the fragments? How did you get into studying it? You mentioned you had found some of them in the American Museum in one of the early American periodicals, but what about them grabbed you and got you interested in building an entire study out of them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So definitely my interest in it sort of came from some of these archival encounters, reading through these magazines, noticing this kind of form that kept popping up. And it's one of those things that absolutely could have just sort of popped up in terms of like a printer. I mean, you think of like, you know, the printers in the late 18th century who like needed to fill a certain space, right, on the page. And they're like, okay, let's throw a fragment in there. And it kind of works. It sort of like fits with the idea of a little chunk of text that needs filling. So I found it really intriguing, that it kept sort of like popping up in these little corners of magazines and newspapers. And then I was also noticing that some more canonical writers, writers more known to us, early American novelists, people like Charles Brockton Brown, individuals like that were also interested in this form. And so it became, it's one of those things where the more when you know something, you start to see it more and more and more. And it just sort of started to accumulate and sort of take shape in that way, piece by piece, right? Fragment by fragment, sort of
Fragment by fragment. Yeah. And at points, particularly in the early part of the book, you're using two terms. One is fragment, another is the term that was often used at the time, ruins.
Yes.
And of course, in Europe, many people saw ruins as romantic. A ruin is something that evokes the past and is somehow to be treasured. Whereas in the United States, fragments and ruins were exactly the last thing that the politicians governing the new nation wanted. They wanted to emphasize the unity of the new nation, not fragmentation. So maybe you could say a bit about the relationship between the concept of a fragment and the concept of a ruin, and tell us a bit about that. And after you do, we now have questions coming in from the audience that I'll start to introduce as well.
Great. No, that's a really good, two really key terms for me and for this study. And you're, of course, 100% right that ruins, I mean, there was like a kind of rage for ruins in 18th century England with the, recovery of artifacts from the classical world, excavations being done, texts being reprinted. And there we get a lot of the kind of historical fragments that I was talking about. So like a fragment of poetry from a Greek writer, from a Roman writer that's being reprinted then in a British periodical. And I view that kind of ruin culture as being sort of one of the inspiration points for a lot of these writers who are sitting down to compose a fragment. Although I also want to hit on that point that you mentioned about the difference between the reception of ruins in England and America, because absolutely the idea of a ruin or a fragment becomes a lot more politically problematic or volatile when you're attempting to build a nation based theoretically or hypothetically, at least, on the idea of consensus or unity. So a lot of these framing or founding figures in the early nation are really kind of like almost like a love-hate relationship. They're like interested in ruins and fragments, but they're also really, really scared of them and worried about them. So in a lot of ways, I do see the fragment as being a kind of written form almost of this kind of architectural craze that was super popular in Europe and in England, and sort of dealt with carefully in the United States.
That's great. Thanks. We have a couple of questions about the relationship between fragments and different forms, print forms in the early Republic. So Miriam Khan asks, do we see the same typographical and textual fragments in epistolary novels of the period?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And actually, so Emma Corbett is an epistolary novel. And I'm trying to think of the other epistolary novel that I have at the tip of my tongue, but I'll come back to it. Yeah, the kind of the relationship between epistolary novels as a genre and fragments is interesting, because in a way, we might think of an epistolary chain of correspondence as being fragmentary, right? You're getting sort of one piece of the conversation in a letter. I haven't encountered too many examples of the typography specifically being used in those epistolary novels to represent a fragment, other than in Emma Corbett. But there is a kind of way in which that epistolary chain, the sort of space between letters, that is so important for so many of the plots of these novels, that kind of in-between space where all this stuff happens and you as the reader are only getting it in the next letter, is very suggestive of that sort of halting or partial nature of the fragment.
And you also spent time in your analysis of Charlotte Temple, writing about the ways in which letters that are waylaid by others
Yes.
contribute to the fragmentation of Charlotte herself. That, so in a sense, what Charlotte is getting out into the world becomes more and more fragmentary as the novel continues.
No, that's exactly, that's spot on. Yeah, Charlotte Temple is this character in a seduction novel, and she's her letters are sort of torn up basically by her seducer and thrown into the water, and she essentially becomes more and more fragmented, sort of by that process of her letters being torn up.
Yeah, Gerard Holmes links to another genre of the period, asking, is there a connection between the urgency and fragmentary qualities, brevity, incompleteness of 18th and 19th century newspapers and the use of the fragment by literary writers?
Yeah, so many of these fragments were, I see the majority of their publication being in periodicals and newspapers, but a lot of these writers that I look at in the study were very much engaged with newspaper and magazine publication. So someone like Charles Brockton Brown, for instance, who we know primarily as a novelist, but was also very much an important periodical editor, editing at least 2 different periodicals over the course of his life, serializing some of his own novels in periodicals. So he's someone who I view as very much engaged with the relationship between the format of a magazine and the form of a fragment. In fact, in his, so he published a book called Edgar Huntley in 1799. And one of the things that he does for that is he publishes in his own magazine a kind of like an advertisement for it, which is just like an excerpt, basically. This was common. And he titles that excerpt, Edgar Huntley, a fragment, right? So he's explicitly thinking about this portion of his novel that he's publishing in his periodical as a fragment. So it's this interesting moment where the form of the fragment and its publication in a magazine is sort of taking priority over the genre of the novel for him, or at least its emphasis is being shifted. The other kind of author who I would put in a similar category is Washington Irving, who does so much periodical publication. And the sketch is his primary genre, but he's one of these sort of prime movers in the publication of like fragmentary and incomplete styles in this period.
Great. Julia Dower says, hi, Dan, thanks for this great talk. I have a question about your thinking about the relationship between fragment and whole. Early on, you suggest that one thing the fragment affords is the imagination of a new, not yet realized or conceived of whole, one that might theoretically be more equitable or inclusive. I'm curious, though, about whether there are any rogue parts in your research, parts that seem to resist the imagination of a whole at all. I'm curious in part because I'm interested in the politics of the anarchic part that refused to be organized into a whole.
That's great. Hi, Julian. Good to hear from you. Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that I think of in this way is that these fragments, they have that relationship to a possible completion, to that imagined whole, but it's never realized on the page, or very, very rarely is it realized on the page. And so I think that while that door is held open, nonetheless, the printed page sort of like keeps that fragmentary state. And there is a kind of, I don't know, I like that kind of like anarchic energy in a way, especially with these fragments that are so visually marked by their incompletion. These fragments that, end in just asterisks, that end in these typographical gestures. There's this kind of resistance to completion there, this kind of willingness to just say, Yeah, and then there's, just punctuation that doesn't signify anything in specific, right? And I do think about this a little bit in my discussion of Charlotte Temple and the Coquette, where I'm thinking there that those authors are using the fragment and the ruin, specifically there, the idea of ruination, the ruination of a woman, as a kind of resistant sort of trope. And that sort of, they're sort of identifying their main characters as figures who are increasingly fragmented, and they're trying to draw some kind of energy from that, trying to draw some kind of autonomy and power from that rupture, from the community, from that larger whole. But yeah, thank you. That's I like that idea of the sort of like anarchic energy of the fragment.
Yeah, following up on that, I think, in a sense, Jerika Dellenbaugh Dempsey asks, she says, thanks so much, Dan. You mentioned that early fragments in particular were often about people on the outside of society and might have provided an opportunity to imagine redemption. But do you think there's any way that these fragments might have contributed to solidifying ideas about the fundamental deficiency of certain kinds of people? Are the fragments, in a sense, acting in a way opposite to what you suggest they may be aiming to do?
Yes, and that is definitely a possibility. They cut both ways, is one way of thinking about it. I mean, the fragments that I'm looking at here, they are principally written by white, bourgeois, educated writers, right? They are not being written by the prostitute. They're not being written by the wounded veteran. So yes, this is definitely, these are writers who are sort of, using a kind of sentimental gaze, right? And they're looking at these individuals as objects of sympathy, right? They're the fragments are very much invested in that kind of discourse. So I do think of the fragment as being a form that is working to be politically progressive, that it is like that's its goal. It's the best version of itself is trying to do that. But absolutely, it is presenting these, I wouldn't go so far as to call them caricatures, but that it is producing these kinds of sketches of these figures that have the potential to sort of that could potentially like fix them, to use a word that I was using in my talk. But I still think that that's sort of like the form itself, to go back to the idea of the kind of political space that the form itself allows, is resistant to that because it doesn't provide that kind of closure on the figure, right? It doesn't have the last word on the disabled veteran, on the prostitute, right? It sort of leaves that as of yet undefined.
I guess following up on that very indefinition could potentially lead the reader to take the fragment in a variety of different ways, including ways that are not progressive, right? I mean, that don't work the way the author of the fragment might have intended.
That's right. No, that's absolutely true. And the idea that I'm working with, right, is that we're sort of reading with at least the thrust of the author. But certainly, yeah, it is possible that people would have more antagonistic responses, right, to a sympathetic portrayal of one of these figures.
I guess it could happen, yeah. Grant Rawson asks, could you talk about the temporality of the fragment? Are fragments typically narrative, or are there fragments that are more descriptive in nature, such that they start to resemble something more like Irving's sketches, just descriptions of moments in a time and place?
Yeah, no, that's a good point about the sort of scope of the fragments, right? And yes, so a lot of these fragments, especially in the shorter versions, like the periodical and the newspaper ones that don't go on for many, many pages, they do kind of have that feel of being a snapshot, right? So the examples from Matthew Carey's periodical, those are Oh, if I had to guess, I would say about 300 to 500 words each. So they're fairly short. They're kind of giving us a snapshot, a scene, right, of this individual. And what's interesting is that some of the fragments that are being written in novels, right? So, for example, Charles Brockton Brown's publication of Edgar Huntley, A Fragment, and a military fragment in Emma Corbett. Those examples are much longer. And those are very much narrative. Those feel like a piece of a novel that are taken out. So that's one of the reasons why I think of a fragment more as a form than a genre. I think of a genre as something, a novel, a poem, a short story, an essay, whereas the fragment is sort of cutting across all of those genres, right? We have fragments that are poems. We have fragments that are a fragment that reads like an essay or like a portion of a novel. So I see that kind of the scope of the fragment cutting across that variety of genres, but nonetheless, sort of still being beholden to this idea of narrative incompletion, and oftentimes that visual incompletion that we were seeing with Emma Corbett.
Great, thank you. Carol Soteropoulos asks, do you think it worthwhile to pursue cultural transfer that seems on the surface to apply with respect to Friedrich Schlegel's definition of romantic poesy in his Athenaeum fragments to the English and or American context? Or do you know if this has been studied?
Yeah, so German Romanticism, of course, a really important place for fragments. And I talk about it a little bit in American Fragments in the first chapter after the introduction. And my sort of sense, at least, of this period in Germany is that there is primarily, like Schlegel and his contemporaries, that they're primarily they're working in the tradition of like philosophical fragments or philosophical aphorisms, right? Tradition that goes back to Montaigne, right? This idea of sort of like producing these philosophically dense sort of chunks of thought that then move on quickly from one to the other. And I think I see that as sort of part of the soup, right? That's sort of like in the air, right? When the American and British poets and writers are composing fragments, but I do kind of see it as a distinct lineage. I think it's related. They're interested in ideas of incompletion, of partiality, just as the writers that I'm examining are looking at. But they're kind of interested in, if the goal of an American fragment is to sort of present a politically progressive view of an individual, the German romantic fragment is interested in like a revolution of like aesthetic idealism. So they're kind of working on different levels. So I see them kind of historically related and situated in relationship to one another, but I do kind of see them working in distinct ways.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel, for a really stimulating conversation. It's been a great hour. It's hard to believe that our little fragment of time is coming to a close here. I would like to thank you for the conversation, to thank everybody who's been watching today. A few closing notes. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are available on the AAS YouTube channel. So let people know, and in the next few days, next week or so, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. So those who haven't watched it yet can do so. At AAS, our next public program is next Thursday evening, September 22nd at 7 p.m. It's a hybrid program, so we'll be having it right here in Antiquarian Hall and live streaming it on YouTube. Nathaniel Philbrick will join me to talk about his book, Travels with George, In Search of Washington and His Legacy. We have a variety of programs, some of them virtual, some virtual only, some of them in person with live streaming almost every week in October. I do want to mention our next Thursday afternoon book talk, which is October 27th at 2 o'clock, when Michael D'Alessandro will join us to talk about his book, Staged Readings, Contesting Class in Popular American Theater and Literature, 1835 to 1875. Daniel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we hope to see many of you at one or more of our upcoming programs. And for now, Take care. Have a great afternoon.